I'm Andy Brogan, I'm founding partner at Easier Inc. And today in this video I want to talk to you about how to surface and challenge assumptions in the workplace. And to do that, I want to start with a simple question. So don't overthink this. The first answer that comes into your mind is a good one. And the question is, what colour is the earth? Okay, what was your answer? Perhaps you said blue or blue and green, what I call the astronaut answer, thinking of Earth as planet Earth, zoomed out, seen from space. It's a good answer, it's a valid answer, so well done, Major Tom. But it's not the only answer, because you see, if I asked you to swap your gravity boots for Wellington boots, and now you're a farmer or a gardener or something like that, and I asked you the same question, what colour is the Earth? Rather than thinking blue and green ball in space, you're probably thinking dirty brown mud on the ground. So the facts are that what the facts are depends on the assumptions we make. How the world looks depends on where we're looking at it from. And that really matters in the workplace, because you see, the things we do and how we do them are entirely a product of the assumptions we bring to bear. And given that the things we do and how we do them explains what impact we have, if we want more than 1 or 2% impact, where we can just keep doing the things we do and do them a bit better, if we want 5%, 10%, 20%, 100%, 2000% improvement, a step change, transformational impact, then we need to find a way to get beyond just doing today's things better, in order to understand what it would take to do better things. And that means surfacing and challenging our assumptions. So the obvious question is, how do we do that? And the obvious answer, in fact, is by making this relationship between assumptions, actions, and impact visible to ourselves, particularly making the relationship between actions and impact visible. Because when we do that, the assumptions almost present themselves. Now that might sound surprising, but let me use a case study example to explore and explain why that's the case. So here's the example. This is a local authority housing repairs service. So the context is that the local authority owns the properties, and as such they're responsible for maintenance of them. And so in the little process that's on your screen, you can see what happens is tenants will phone up the call centre saying something's broken. The call centre will say what seems to be broken, will come up with a diagnosis, create a works order, send it to a supervisor. The supervisor will allocate that to a tradesperson who will get stuff from the equipment store, go out to the property, bish bash bosh, fix the problem, lovely, done. Okay, so I said to you that the trick to surfacing assumptions is particularly to make the relationship between action and impact visible. So to prove that to you, I'm going to ask you to try and surface the assumptions based only on what I've told you. So if you think about that, all I've told you so far is what the actions are, not what their relationship to impact is. So this is a bit of a trick question, but I'm going to make you do it anyway. So for 2 or 3 minutes on your own or in groups, have a think or a chat about, based on what's on screen, what are the assumptions that are driving things in this system. 2 or 3 minutes and I'll see you back here. Okay, if you're back with me, because that was a trick question, you should have found that pretty tough. You might have found it easy enough to surface assumptions, but even if you did, you must have found it tricky to know which assumptions are valid, which are problematic, which assumptions do we need to challenge versus which assumptions are just true but not very interesting. And the reason that's difficult is because I only gave you the action layer of this system, no relationship to impact. So now I'm going to add just a tiny bit of information about impact and see how that improves your ability to surface the assumptions. So here's this tiny little bit of information, which is when you go with the tradespeople to the equipment store, You go there first thing in the morning because that's when the day starts and that's when all the tradespeople go to the equipment store to get their stuff. And what you see is a giant queue of tradespeople with all their vans in the car park, stood at a little equipment store desk with one person at the desk and one person behind it, running around frantically trying to gather all the stuff that the tradesperson at the front of the queue needs. And in the hands of those tradespeople are about a half dozen bits of paper, one bit of paper per works order, because what's happened is each tradesperson has been allocated their work for the day. And their work isn't just one job, it's multiple jobs. So think about the maths of this. It's 8 a.m. in the morning. A dozen tradespeople turn up at a single equipment store holding half a dozen bits of paper. That's the best part of, 72 jobs, something like that. And that's got to be serviced by one person at the desk and one person running around crazy in the background getting all the stuff that the tradespeople need. That's not a recipe for success. And so it doesn't take a management consulting guru or any work of genius to understand that there are assumptions at work here that aren't working very well. What I'd like you to do then is, given just this tiny little sliver of extra information that I've given you, that goes from just talking about the action layer to now connecting action to impact, in your groups, 3 more minutes, I'd like you to have a think, have a chat about how many assumptions can you now identify that explain what's going on in this little corner of the system. 3 minutes, go for it and come back to me. Okay, so I suspect that you found that a lot easier. You've probably got numerous, maybe even dozens of assumptions that you spotted there. Assumptions like it's more efficient to allocate all of the jobs of the day to the tradespeople rather than one at a time. That's an assumption. What's another assumption that's going on here? Well, another assumption is that tradespeople should gather all of the stuff that they need for all of the jobs all at once. That's an assumption. Another assumption, tradespeople can't be trusted to get the materials from the materials store themselves. They have to wait at the desk for the person at the desk to tell the person behind the desk to go and get it for them. That's an assumption. Another assumption, tradespeople should go to a materials store to get their materials, rather than materials should be delivered to site for the tradespeople. That's an assumption. One more, there are more than this, but one more. Local authority tradespeople should only get materials from local authority materials stores. No B&Q cards, anything like that. You've got to get it from our official local authority store. That's an assumption. So what should probably be going through your head, even as I read those out, is that there are loads of assumptions here, but still we're kind of stuck in this trap of, but how do we know which ones are valid, which ones are safe to break, which ones are material in terms of having big leverage over our performance? Yes, having this relationship between impact and action, if you like, makes it easier to identify the assumptions, to surface them, but does it make it any easier to know which ones we should be questioning and challenging, or does it just help us have a big old list of assumptions and no ability to differentiate between them? Well, the answer at the minute is the latter. The answer at the minute is we've just got a big list of assumptions. So how do we get beyond that? Well, the answer to that is that we need to move from a lens which is about bits of the system to a lens which is about all of the system and how it acts as one whole. And so to do that, I want to point something out to you, which is, you'll notice that when I talked about how this little bit of data around delay at the materials store came about, it wasn't by asking people for their opinion. It wasn't by asking for the management reports. it was by wearing out the shoe leather, opening the eyes, opening the ears, and going and seeing. And that matters because you see, asking people for their perspective on the issues comes preloaded with their assumptions. Looking at the management data comes preloaded with assumptions because the management data is stuff that we report and record because we think it matters. But how do we know that it matters unless we go and connect to reality? And now what I'm saying is not only do we need to get out from behind our opinions, out from behind our desks, out from behind our data, but we also need to get out from behind our roles and our functions in order to see the whole system. So we need to look end to end across the process. And so to bring that to life, that's what we're going to do now. So looking towards the back end of the process, as we follow the tradesperson from the store to the property where they're going to do the repair, the first thing that we see as we walk through the doors is that the tradesperson looks at the works order and they say, oh, good job that I've got a van full of stuff that's going to be really useful for doing the job that's on this works order. It is a shame though that what's on this works order isn't actually anything to do with what this property needs. Because you see, 95% of the time when we walk into the property, we discover that what's on the works order is wrong. So now we can start to see that by seeing how the system works end to end, we can start to differentiate between the assumptions that matter. Because we could, if we'd only visited the equipment store, spend the rest of our life experimenting with assumptions about how to make sure that the delay at the equipment store is removed. But all that would serve to do is get tradespeople to jobs with the wrong stuff faster. That's not going to improve performance. What's going to improve performance in this system is to get tradespeople to jobs with the right stuff faster. And how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute, but I want to ask you to do another exercise on your own or in groups for a second. And this is an exercise not about the case study that I'm showing you, but about your workplace. I want you to think about and have a conversation about, where do you see these sorts of systemic issues that happen? What we might call squeezing the balloon issues, where because something doesn't happen quite right over here, we end up with problems down here. And I'd like you to first of all identify one or two examples of where you see that in your work. And then I'd like you to have a conversation around, what do you think might be the assumptions that are driving that? Okay, so over to you. I'm going to give you, say, 10 minutes to have a conversation about this and then come back to me. Okay, now you're back with me. I hope you had a good conversation there, and I hope you managed to identify some good chewy examples of where there are assumptions in your system that are driving that squeezing the balloon behaviour that I talked about. Problems over here that create bigger problems over there. Coming back to our case study for a moment though, what we've identified in this housing repairs example is that one of the big points of leverage that we can identify by looking at this system as a system is that there are assumptions that are driving the actions that we are taking to diagnose the problem, that are leading to an impact, which is we end up with the wrong diagnosis and then a whole load of ancillary problems hanging off that. So as we move towards our better future, where we're thinking about how we're going to have that transformational impact, what we're thinking about is, how do we solve that problem? Because that problem is key. And the answer to this is pretty straightforward again. Just like I talked about, the simple answer to how we surface the assumptions is understanding that relationship between actions and impact. How we now act on the assumptions that matter is a pretty straightforward approach of saying, not how do we solve every problem everywhere for everyone for all eternity, but rather it's an approach that I call take one, do one, and it's super simple. So here's how it works in the case study example. So we want to run an experiment called how do we get a good diagnosis? And in order to do this, we're going to take one case, one instance of a repair, or rather a problem being reported into the call centre. And we're going to ask ourselves, how can we get a robust diagnosis? What are all the different ways we could think about that problem and try and approach that problem? And based on what we've done to surface the assumptions earlier, we might say, well, here are some experiments. We could put a tradesperson in the call centre. Maybe having that level of skill means we can get a good diagnosis over the phone. Or maybe we could provide training to a call centre worker. Or maybe we could provide something sort of algorithmic where call centre workers have a set of smart questions to help them diagnose the problem. Or maybe we challenge all of those and we say, well, we're not convinced that we can get a good diagnosis over the phone, that we think what we have to do is go into the property and see it ourselves. So I've just called out 4 possible experiments there. Tradesperson in the call centre, training for call centre workers, algorithmic approach, or diagnose it by seeing it. Which of these are we going to do? Well, the answer is we could do any or all of them, but we're only going to know which one works by trying it. So this is where you can box a bit clever. You can sort of say, well, you know, the most expensive of these we might think is sending the tradesperson out to diagnose it on site. If we can just get it right over the phone, that feels like that would be most efficient. So let's try that one first. And then we might say, well, if we try that one first, it's going to cost a bit of money to set up an algorithm. So let's not start there. It's going to take a bit of time to train someone. So let's not start there. So let's just for 1 or 2 cases, because remember, take one, do one. Let's put a tradesperson in the call centre and see what happens. So that's what we do. And because this is a real case study, that's exactly what we did do. So we put a tradesperson into the call centre and they spent just 1 day diagnosing stuff over the phone, raising works orders alongside the call centre workers, sending them out to other tradespeople. And the experiment was dead simple. It was what happened to the number of works orders that were wrong for the tradesperson diagnosed works orders versus the call centre diagnosed ones. Guess what the answer was? A big fat 0 difference. So what did that tell us? Well, because the tradesperson had done sufficient volume and because we knew they were a quite skilled, well-respected tradesperson, it told us very simply that trying to diagnose problems over the phone doesn't work. So there's no point now training the call centre workers in diagnosis, and there's no point coming up with some algorithm for it, because essentially we've proven to ourselves that the best thing to do is to get someone on site who has the skills to diagnose it on site. So that's how we start to test new assumptions in practice. This process of take one, do one, it's so simple. It's about saying we're not trying to solve for scale right out the gates, because the minute we try and solve for scale, it becomes so difficult to run that experiment. We're just saying what's the first thing that we've learned that we need to be good at. And in this system, the first thing we've learned we need to be good at is diagnosis. And the experiments told us that what we need to do to get a good diagnosis is get into the property. So now we know what problem we need to solve, which is how, when someone calls the call centre, can we get the right trade into that property at a time of the tenant's convenience. Now that leads to some ancillary issues, doesn't it? Because now we're not going to send a tradesperson that doesn't know what the problem is to the equipment store first. They're going to go straight to the property. So now we need to solve problems like, how do we get the materials to the property? Are we going to ask the tradesperson to leave, or are we asking the equipment store to be peripatetic and deliver? Well, that's more experiments that we can run. But you see, it's working out those assumptions as a system that allow us to sequence the experiments, that allow us to essentially get things in the right order so that we work on the right problems and everything gets pulled forward from there. Okay, so let me put a little pin in the process then. Just recap where we've got to. So we're interested in surfacing assumptions and challenging assumptions. To surface assumptions, we need to first of all understand this relationship between actions and impact. To do that, we need to get out from behind our desk, behind our management reports, behind our opinions, out from our roles, out from our functions, and we need to go and see things as a system, because if we don't do that, we'll end up fixing problems here but just shifting them over there. We'll squeeze the balloon. So it's only when we understand the relationship between actions and impact as a system that we can see the assumptions that really matter. Now that we know those are the assumptions that really matter, we can start to experiment with them. But to experiment with them, we have to do that at the level of take one, do one. Because if we try and experiment at scale, it will get us bogged down and it will become nigh on impossible to run the experiment. And as we do take one, do one then, what I want you to think about is 3 phases. Phase 1, all we're doing is learning how to be effective. We're not interested in how do we make that efficient. We're not interested in how do we do that at scale. We're just interested in, does doing this work? Does putting a tradesperson in the call centre work? Once we know what effective looks like, we can think about how to make that efficient. So once we know that what effective looks like is getting the right trade into the property to diagnose, we can work out how to make it efficient to get that tradesperson there at a time of someone's convenience. We can work out how to get the materials to them once they're there and once they've got a robust diagnosis. So that's the efficient phase. So effective first, then efficient, and only then scalable. Because once we've learned to do that for 1 or 2 jobs that need to be fixed, we now have a model of working that we can confidently and in a worthwhile way start solving the problems of scaling up. So we can start thinking about how do we train people. We can start thinking about how do we make the equipment store peripatetic, if that's what the experiments have taught us. So those 3 phases of experimentation are the most robust way that I've found to not just surface assumptions, but to challenge them in practice. So it's effective, efficient, and scalable. So back in your groups for a minute, or if you're on your own, just have a think about this for yourself. I want you to go back to the exercise you did last and think about some of those issues that you talked about, the systemic issues where we squeeze the balloon, where problems over here are consequences of problems over there. And I want you to think about how might you take that systemic perspective we've talked about, and how might you set yourself up to take that take one, do one approach to experimentation, where the sequence is effective, efficient, and scalable. Take, let's say, 10 minutes to think about that, or to at least have a good chat about that in your group, and then come back to me. Okay, so I hope you've had a good discussion again. We're going to finish up just about here, but I just wanted to summarise what are the key points in terms of this work to surface and challenge assumptions. So here they are again. Make visible the relationship between actions and impact, because doing that makes spotting the assumptions easy. In making that relationship visible, don't do it by asking for people's opinions or by looking at the management reports. Do it by wearing out the shoe leather, by opening the eyes, by opening the ears. Get out into the work and see it for yourself. Thirdly, see the work as a system. Get out from behind your roles or functions. You've got to see how it joins up, otherwise you'll end up solving problems in sort of slices of the system that actually isn't really solving a problem at all when you look at it systemically. So seeing it as a system. And then once you've surfaced those assumptions, all you know is where to start. So remember that you're going to have to experiment next. Take one, do one. Effective, efficient, and scalable. And so if I was to try and capture all of that in a quote, I think I'd probably go to Buckminster Fuller, whose view was, don't change the system, build a new one that makes the old one obsolete. I think that's the essence of this approach, which is about saying you can't really tweak within the existing system. What you have to do is step back and see the big picture. And then what you need to do is very deliberately create little microcosms of goodness in order to build the new system. Okay, so I hope that's been useful for you. I've enjoyed talking to you about it. Go forth and good luck.